Hi folks, you're with Tacitus today, your pushback channel, and thank you for joining this audio live stream. In this essay, I'd like to talk about the practice and if you like, the concept as well of the various freedoms that we have or have had, they're going now, but the freedoms we had in the West, and how much these freedoms were a source of Western wealth. It's no accident that the areas of the planet that had the most freedoms and freedoms that were codified and independently judged through independent courts of law and independent contracts and that sort of thing, that these countries or these places were the richest in the world by far, the most technologically advanced, the most organizationally advanced, and the best, very well administered and well ordered and so on. Those areas were the richest in the world, and that's no accident. It didn't just come out by magic, and it's not like the propagandists claim that all those white people just stole everything from everybody else, and that's why they're rich. So we've got the very nature of freedoms that we've taken for granted are changing, and they're being taken away or modified and recast in such a way that it's tantamount to the freedoms being taken away. And I'll talk about sort of those freedoms generically, but I had no idea as a young man. I knew the freedoms existed, like I did civics class at school and so on, but I had no idea how unique those freedoms were until I started traveling on business around the world, and countries that I thought had a similar sort of situation to the West, whether it be Australia or Britain, United States, whatever, those countries in fact had quite restricted freedoms for anything other than the elites, and that initially as a young man took me aback. I had no idea. Now, as a Western guy, I had many more freedoms than the locals had, but this idea, and I just want to, things that we might take for granted, that I can travel from, for example, I can travel from Australia to the United States to do business. I don't have to get a government department to approve anything, or I suppose a visa maybe, but I don't have to get a government department to approve anything. I don't ask anyone's permission. I don't have to get local political goons having to sign papers every few miles as I go along the road, or anything like that. I can, on behalf of my employer at the time, I can open up a business in the US. I can register bank accounts. I can do a whole range of, employ people, to do a whole range of commercial activities that you couldn't do in another country. I can hire a car in Los Angeles and drive across the United States to, one end of California to the other, or from LA to New York, or to, I can do any of those things without having to get someone's permission, other than signing the hire car agreement or something, but don't have to get government permission. So those freedoms, you may say, well, so what? What's the big deal about that? I can go and have meetings with anybody to discuss business, if they're willing to meet and that sort of thing. I can do a whole range of things without having to ask the government's permission. I can't break the law, of course, but that aside, I've got freedom, or anybody coming along has got the freedom to do that, whether as a tourist or in business. I can buy any magazine or newspaper I want. I can watch any TV channel that I want. I can pay for it. I can stay at any hotel I want, and so on and so forth. I can go around taking photographs of the Liberty Bell in Philadelphia, or the Lincoln Monument in Washington, and all these sorts of things. Now, those freedoms outside of the West don't exist, or they exist in sort of declining and diminishing situations. So, there are some countries where you can't take photographs of such and such, where you can't travel somewhere, you can't go here or there, you can't have meetings, you can't do. There's a vast array of things you can't do. You can do it if you get the relevant government permission and if you bribe people and that sort of thing. There are countries where if you're bringing goods into the country, you forget about that it's going to clear the customs ports of entry unless you're running around bribing the crap out of people, or you have to pay a local agent to do it. I was at one third world country where, again, they've got a very rich elite there. It's one third world country doing business, and I'm sitting. I'm in the hotel. It's on the equator or near the equator, and so it's a hot place. I'm sitting outside having dinner one night and one evening, and a guy somehow he knows who I am, and he knows sort of pretty much everything about me, and he peers and he says, look, you may not understand this fully, being a white boy, but you're going to have to bribe a lot of people if you want to get anything done here. So I'll act as your agent, and just to keep your hands clean, I'll run around and do all the bribes, and I'm just Mr. 10% or whatever, how much he wanted. I think it was 10% actually. And this is although I'm sitting there sort of quite, again, I was a fairly youngish guy at the time, sitting there gobsmacked, like my jaws, on the ground, thinking, how does he know me? How can he find me so easily? How can he like I've had a few meetings during the day, and those people at the meetings, they've all obviously got together, or someone's given him the full picture. I mean, he had as many details as I had. And I was the one doing it. and he was very matter of fact and very, very sort of deadpan about it. This is how it is, and this is how we do it here. And if you, but the clangor is, if you don't do these things, forget about making anything happen. You're fucked. You do this or else. And he had it quite well done. I'm sure your employer won't be happy with you, given the money they've spent for you to do this running around, if you come back to the office empty-handed. Whereas, if you pay these bribes, you'll get results, and I'm sure your employer will be happy, and you'll make your budget for the month, and you'll get a promotion and so on. This guy he'd obviously done this many times before. But this is an illustration of how different the West was from the rest of the world. And again, it's no accident the West is rich and the rest of the world not, or not as rich, or even dirt fucking poor. Now, in this particular country where bribery and corruption was just how it is, I mean, you walk across dead bodies in the street. There's the most terrible, sort of unspeakable levels of poverty and deprivation in these places, whilst the rich elite, play corrupt games with corrupt payments and so on. And it's a well-oiled corruption machine as well. There are very high levels of import duties on some products. So these guys have their own special army of pirates that sort of use these pirate boats, small boats, to move stuff around and avoid customs duties. I mean, there was an element of almost dark humor about it all, the elaborate sort of methods they use. But anyway, these third world places, they're poor countries, and for good reason. No one trusts or believes in government. No one believes in the impartiality of the courts. No one believes that the law will be uniformly applied. No one believes that contracts will be honoured. Everyone thinks that there's, as long as you know the right person somewhere, you can pull strings, and that'll be what decides outcomes. And the belief that the people at the lower end, even the lower half of society, they live wretched lives, and they're kind of already dead anyway. So why would you care about them? There are these sort of things. No one has a national view or fellow citizens. There's this strange form of tribalism that seems to exist that it's difficult to come to grips with. But anyway, so the West had this unusual freedoms. Now, to have a consumer society where people can go and purchase, at their discretion, consumer goods. Now, these consumer goods can be, household furniture, electricals, a new camera, or a new phone, or car, motor vehicle, all these sorts of things, going on vacations. These are all discretionary determinations that a citizen makes or a consumer makes, and they'll buy whatever they think the best value item is. Whether it might be the cheapest, or it might be the best made, it might be the cheapest to own in terms of cost of ownership. Maybe it's gives you great prestige, like a brand name product, or whatever the reason. The consumer decides, and it can be the advertising and marketing maybe got to them, or they made hard rational choices, or they operated within their budget, and so on. But it's a consumer choice. Now, to have a consumer society and consumer choice, it requires a certain degree of freedom. It requires actually a lot of freedoms in relative terms. Freedom to associate, freedom to find the truth. For example, if a company says that their motor vehicle travels at 5 million miles an hour and flies to the moon and back, and it doesn't, then that company can be liable to so the government can go after them. Consumers can chase them for false advertising and making ridiculous claims and so on. So the consumer has a lot of relative power insofar as the advertising must be truthful and fair and reasonable and these sorts of things, and there are laws to support that. And there's also tort law options, particularly in, say, the US, where, and tort law meaning that you purchase the product and you're now worse off as a consequence because the product was faulty or false claims were made. So you can sue for restitution, which is the overall architecture, if you like, of conceptual architecture of tort law, restitution for damages. So these freedoms, however, to these consumer freedoms to associate, to gather information, to make decisions, to decide what you will and won't buy, and so on. That requires a competitive market economy. It requires that if there's a gap in the market where there is no products or services that are servicing that need, if you will, that a company or an entrepreneur or someone comes in to service it. Similarly, with product competition, that there's always someone who's going to create a better product or produce it more cheaply or to make it more available through better distribution and organization and so on. But again, these require multiple layers of freedom and contract and impartial law, impartial courts and so on to honor contracts and the like, so that if someone dishonors a contract, then you can go to an independent, impartial court. You can say, well, Billy Bob's right in his claim, Jimmy Jack did, or the company X or something did produce make false claims or produce an inferior product or a product that didn't meet the specification that it was sold under, and so on. So these are freedoms, but also the ability to have independent in judgment and accountability. Now these things again were bedrock part of Western society and wealthy society and a consumer society. But those freedoms and those codified laws and those independent courts and independently judged and arbitrated contracts, that all of it gets in the way of the globalist project. So whether it be mass migration, whether it be the politicization of courts, the ideology that's has crept into education and the think tanks, the control of the media, the idea that the globalists control the one source of truth and information. And if you even ask questions about it, you're a Nazi and have to be crushed and deplatformed and shadow banned and whatever else. This is the globalization project. So those freedoms that were a central part of the consumer society are getting in the way of the globalist project. They can't have independent courts. They can't have non-ideological determinations of contracts. They can't have uniform application of the rule of law, because all of it gets in the way of the globalist project. Now, it's not necessarily against a consumer society, but in the hard sort of realpolitik rationalising of the globalist project and what they must do to put it in place, then they say, well, look, those things have to go. This freedom of association, the freedom to find the truth, the uniform application of law, all of these things have to go because they get in the way of the globalist project. Now, it's a collateral damage decision. Well, we have to do this, therefore that collateral damage is acceptable. And like any ideology anywhere throughout time, particularly in the 20th century, particularly the communist socialist ideologies, Chairman Mao's China, the Soviet Union and Stalin and Lenin and Trotsky and so on, Pol Pot in Cambodia, and other, smaller, the fanatical ideological East Germans during the Cold War and so on. This is something that Nicolae Ceausescu in Romania. This idea of ideology is, okay, the goal is the socialist paradise. That's the goal. And in order to reach that, we must accept collateral damage. Now, maybe it's a lot of collateral damage, such as tens of millions of people we have to murder, or we have to starve, or we have to arbitrarily, kill or dispossess. But that's the price worth paying as we pursue this goal. So that's the attitude the globalists are taking. As we pursue the globalist objective, we just must accept collateral damage, some of which we'd rather not, but we'll accept it. And the consumer society requires many freedoms and impartial, independent application of the law and contract law and so on. That gets in the way, so that's got to go. Now, replacing it though, the globalists are sort of giving themselves some sort of solace by saying, well, okay, consumer society is going to go, fine. We have to accept that as the collateral damage. But what we're going to do is we're going to have half a dozen, maybe 5, 6, 7 tops businesses in the world, in the globalist world. And those businesses will not necessarily sell consumer goods or rent or provide consumer goods, although there'll be some of that. What the real issue is the essentials of life, roof over your head, energy, food, water, the essentials of life will become the new consumer society. So the things that the people must have that they can't do without, they can't make a decision of, you know what, this week I won't drink any water or something. They can't do that. This week I won't have food, or guess what, I'll sleep out in the snow this week. They can't make those decisions. They have to have the shelter. They have to have the food, the water, the energy. They have to have those things. And those things will be controlled by a small handful of globalist corporations. And you've got nowhere to go but through them to acquire. And that will be, I believe, the new consumer society. Now, there may be a tiny consumer society for the rich elites, but there won't be that many of them. I mean, if you look at the world population, there'll be out of 8 billion, you'll be lucky if there'll be even 10 million of these elite rich around the world. The private jet owning type folks, and they'll own. They'll be the only real consumers. They'll be the consumers that'll buy the prime cuts of beef and again, the private jets, the yachts, and the waterfront mansions with servants and so on. So I think we'll be returning to really a feudal system where you look at, say Britain in say the mid 1700s, and remember at the time England was probably the freest country in the world even then in terms of rights and so on, and rights that were protected by codified law. Very important, the codified law. Having rights that are airy-fairy and just sort of, basic undefined bullshit, that's not a right. If it's clearly and totally codified and independent courts hear it, then it becomes a right, but only then. And it's something we need to sort of understand. These flavour of the month rights for trans people or gay or this or that, they're not really rights. They're just flavour of the month bullshit, and if they're not clearly codified, then they're meaningless ultimately. So So even Britain in the mid 1700s, with it wasn't a very big population, I mean less than 10 million, but about 8 million, 7, 8 million, I think. But they had really, say 3,000 people, the aristocrat class, about 3,000 people that were running things. 600 or so families were actually, now they were quite well educated. They believed in, they were reasonably nationalistic, and they believed that if they kept the mob happy, that they could stay in power. So it was a contract between the governed and the governing, and there were various levels of sort of noblesse oblige, if you like, that the upper classes have, and it worked, passably well. England went from being a backwater to being a world power in probably 70 years. If you look at, say, the early 1700s, because they'd fallen really, or I suppose late 1600s, I guess. But they'd sort of started to fall by the wayside, and yet they came very quickly, and during the 7 Years' War, 1756 to 1763, really became a world power, eclipsed briefly by Napoleon Bonaparte, but otherwise they stayed the world power until the late 1800s, really. So an astonishing run there for a small island with a small population, but nonetheless, the very small elite were pretty much making every decision. Again, 3,000 people from a population of 7 or 8 million. And I think we're returning, we'll go back to that. And I think a consumer society with rights and freedoms enshrined in law, I think that was a short aberration which is disappearing. And the globalist project is the prime mover in taking away those rights and freedoms. So that's why we're moving away from a consumer society and moving to one of just a handful of oligopolists, monopolists. And the new frontier of the consumer society is that we'll only be able to acquire the essentials of life at a very high price from this small elite, assuming the globalist project ends up being put in place. I mean, God willing, it won't be, but it's certainly at this stage it looks like they'll if not achieving an outright success, and certainly a close approximation of it. But again, we can only pray that they don't. You've been Tacitus today, your Pushback channel, and thank you for listening.